Macmillan Audio presents Global Wording, the fascinating story of the evolution of English by Charles Hodgson.
Hi, my name is Charles Hodgson, and this audiobook is a fun introduction to the history of our language. I produce an internet radio program called Podictionary, the podcast for word lovers. You can hear me every day talking about words and language because I'm a word lover. And in particular, I love the history of words, their etymology, the backstories behind what makes each word the way it is to us today. In each episode, I choose one common word that you probably already have in your vocabulary, and I tell you something that you probably didn't know about the word. Sometimes words used to have different meanings, and we can trace the reasons those meanings changed. Words are like building blocks, and seeing what those building blocks are made of gives us a window into what life was like centuries ago. Sometimes I just tell the story of the first person to write the word down. It's fun to explore the human side of people who lived long ago, their greatness and their appalling mistakes. I'd love you to listen. You can find it on the web at podictionary.com. In producing Podictionary, I've learned a lot about how the language we speak came into being. We often just assume that the words we use and how we use them are part of a language that's the way it is, just because that's the way it is. But what I've found out is that English is what we've made it, and it's still being made. In Global Wording, I'll explore the circumstances and events that brought English to where it is today. There's a huge amount to cover in this topic, so I don't have a prayer of getting to it all. So instead, I'm going to talk about the things I think are most likely to stick in your memory. Some because you've already heard the names or events I'll be talking about, and I'll just be refreshing your memory and putting things in context. Others because they in themselves are fun facts and little stories that relate to how English grew to be arguably the most important language on the planet. When an English professor talks about the history of English, he or she breaks it into 3 parts: Old English, Middle English, and Modern English. I'm going to do that too. But before I talk about Old English, I'm going to talk about the place we call England before there was any English at all. 1. A land before English. Although what I want to tell you about here is what was happening in the place we now call England before anyone there began speaking anything we might call English, I actually need to geographically move away from the British Isles to find my way even further back in time. On the way there, I'll make a stop in the year 1786 to tell you about a man named William Jones. Stop right there, I hear you moaning. I know you don't want to memorize a bunch of dates and the names of dead people, so I'm going to make it as easy as I can for you. I'll try to keep the dates to a minimum, and instead, I'll try to tie the people and times I'm talking about to things that you already recognize. 10 years after the Declaration of Independence, this guy Jones stands up in the city of Calcutta and presents a paper to a bunch of language scholars. He had this idea that even though the average Englishman couldn't understand a word that the average Greek was saying, and that in turn the average Greek couldn't understand a word of Hindustani, his theory was that at some point all these languages traced back to a common root. Now, in fact, this wasn't a completely original idea. Someone else had thought of it before. But context is king, as I recently heard someone say. And the context here was that William Jones was not only Sir William Jones, and not only was he president of the Asiatic Society of Bengal, the group that he was addressing, but at the time, India was ruled by England, and Calcutta was its capital, and England had sent Sir William Jones to fill the role of judge of the Supreme Court. So when he had an idea, people tended to listen. Now, you don't have to remember William Jones's name, but here's one more little story about him that might help him stick in your memory. Before he was dispatched to India, and before he had this idea about languages, he had a shot at another historical event that, had it happened, would certainly have you recognizing his name. After the American Declaration of Independence, Benjamin Franklin was over in France, working at the beginnings of international diplomacy, when who should turn up in town but William Jones? It was Jones's quiet diplomatic assignment, some say, to see if there were any terms by which America could be persuaded to come back and rejoin the British Empire. A hopeless assignment, you think? Well, Benjamin Franklin might have thought so too, but he did give Jones credit for making compelling arguments. It's hard to imagine what the world might be like if William Jones had been successful, but we'd certainly remember him for it. Instead, he's remembered by those who look at language history as the guy who proposed the theory that there was once a people and a language that we now call Indo-European. As you might have gathered, Jones was no dope, and in fact, he knew almost 30 languages. Actually, the reason he put himself forward as a candidate to become a Supreme Court Justice for Bengal was that he wanted to be posted to India so he could study languages there. As he studied the ancient laws of India in their original languages, what he noticed was that there were a whole bunch of words that were actually pretty close matches not only to the same words in English, but to words spread all over Europe and well into the Indian subcontinent. Based on these ideas, many scholars now believe that about 5,000 to 7,000 years ago, a group of semi-nomadic farmers originating in the area northeast of the Black Sea, that's east of Ukraine and west of Kazakhstan, spread out in almost all directions, and by force of arms or strength of good ideas, spread their language across an unbelievably huge swath of 2 continents. Whether these people actually existed or not, or whether they were fighters or traders, is up for debate. But for our purposes, it's beside the point, because it's indisputable that an amazing number of languages are related through Indo-European. Humans and human-like creatures have been moving in and out of what we now call England for 500,000 years. But the British Isles haven't always been isles. Probably more than once they were peninsulas of Europe. In any case, the last ice sheets didn't melt off jolly old England until 12 to 15,000 years ago. And sometime after that, the main groups of people to claim the British Isles as home seem to have been related to the Celtic or Celtic peoples, who were also linguistically related to the Gauls of France. We can assume that all of these people were pretty tribal and spoke regional dialects, although they were probably intelligible between groups. All of these language dialects were members of the Indo-European family of languages, but we don't know a great deal about them, because the people weren't literate, and they didn't write anything down. But it doesn't much matter, since, although they lived in what became England, the language that they spoke had little to no influence on English. The oldest documents referring to the British Isles appeared in the 6th century BCE. That BCE stands for Before the Common Era, and is the politically correct stand-in for BC, meaning before Christ. That first reference does not call the British Isles the British Isles, but instead calls the people who live there Albiones, which is a Celtic word. It was the Romans who popularized the word Britain in the Latin form Britannia. They adopted an earlier Prytanni, with a P, that had also been a Celtic word. Some think Prytanni meant painted people. That's certainly true of Picti, which is what the Romans called the people in Scotland, but Picti was a Latin word, and if Prytanni was Celtic, then it's unlikely those Celtic Britons called themselves painted. It was the Romans who took over Britain in 43 AD that appear to have brought literacy to England, although in Latin. Of course, Latin, too, is an Indo-European language. Although you hear so often that this or that English word comes from Latin, and it was Latin that the Romans spoke, this Roman occupation of England that lasted 4 centuries still didn't have much to do with the English language, except possibly in one respect. During the period of Roman rule, people in Britain began to become Christians. The Latin church words that they learned didn't exactly thrive through the political upheavals that followed, but they may have laid the groundwork for at least some Old English words that were yet to come. When the Roman Empire collapsed, and the Romans pulled out of England in the year 418, they left behind them a mixed culture of Latin speakers and tribal Celtic dialects. Latin was definitely the prestige language, and the language of literacy, but the power vacuum that the Romans left invited local strongmen, and particularly Celtic people from Ireland and Scotland, to make war on the soft and civilized remnants of Roman Britain. This in turn caused those besieged leaders to call for help. Now that the Romans couldn't help anymore, it seemed that the next best choice would be the Anglo-Saxons. At least that's how the very first English historian, a fellow named Bede, tells the story. According to him, in the year 449, 3 ships arrived at the invitation of a British local king, ostensibly to defend the kingdom. The tone is that this was an invitation that he came to regret, since those darn Anglo-Saxons took over the joint. Obviously, 3 ships couldn't dominate a whole country. There is very likely some truth to Bede's account, but the larger story is something more along the lines of the Germanic invaders, who Bede called Saxons, Angles, and Jutes, moved in to fill the power vacuum left by the Romans, and that their actual takeover of Britain took about 2 centuries. To some extent, the Celtic peoples were pushed back into Wales, but the thinking is that the Anglo-Saxons moved into the power positions in British society and basically treated the Romanized Celts like dirt. As a result, it was the Germanic languages in several dialects of Angles, Saxons, Frisians, and Jutes that eventually became what we now call Old English. Neither Latin from the earlier Roman period nor Celtic from all those downtrodden indigenous Britons made much of an impact at all. In fact, the name of that westernmost enclave of Celtic hangers-on, Wales, was in Old English both the word for foreigner and slave, reflecting the lowly social status of the original inhabitants. At this point, you might be cursing my inability to stick to my promise not to be rattling off a bunch of dates and names. Sorry. The important points are that Britain was illiterate and pre-English 2,000 years ago when it was taken over by the Romans. Then, about 1,500 years ago, the German Anglo-Saxons sauntered in to begin what we can call English. And so finally, our history can begin. 2. How we know what we know. These days we are awash in recorded information. In a year in North America, more than 100,000 books are published. Plus, there are about 40,000 newspapers, magazines, etc. There are more than 12,000 radio and TV stations that all have archives or produce transcripts. Add to this the world of blogs, email, corporate communication, and you can see that when a big dictionary wants to study the meaning of words, it's by no means impossible to build up a database of sample text amounting to a couple billion words, as is now being managed by the people at Oxford Dictionaries. But back when the Celts were backcountry farmers and the invading Anglo-Saxons were barbarian hordes, no one was writing anything down, except perhaps a few fading aristocrats, and they were writing in Latin. On top of this challenge of an almost complete lack of human resources in the documenting for posterity department, if anything did get written down back then, it had a very high likelihood of being burned, lost, or simply turning into dust in the intervening centuries. There's an old Monty Python skit that describes a brontosaurus as thin at one end, much thicker in the middle, and thin again at the far end. The depth of historical data on how English evolved is kind of like that. We're in a part where it's much thicker, but it's very thin at the far end. In fact, the very first Old English word that we know about dates from about the year 550, and was something like keol. It means ship. And the only reason we know about this word is that it was mentioned in passing in a Latin document. We have to wait another 50 years before the second Old English word reveals itself. And so it goes. Obviously, people were talking to each other, but because no one was writing anything down, we have to piece together the language that they were using from the rare scraps that have survived. Many of the oldest Old English words that we know about appeared not in a composition of Old English prose or poetry, but in something called a gloss. Now, I'm sure you've looked things up in a glossary, and the reason a glossary is called a glossary is because it's a collection of glosses. A gloss is an explanation of what a word means. In the context of Old English, one of the important ways we know how people spoke more than 1,000 years ago is that when they were studying the Bible and other sacred texts, these were universally written in Latin. But to help scholars interpret the Latin, many ancient texts were scribbled on in English. Think of it. Those ancient, illuminated holy books, with beautiful, giant colored letters starting the lead paragraphs, all crafted with gold and rare pigments. They'd been studied for decades or centuries in the quiet monasteries, when some monk pulls them off the shelf and begins defacing them by writing in an English translation between the lines of Latin text. Sometimes it was a word here or there. In other cases, it was a whole passage. Sometimes translations word for word, sometimes translations instead of the sense of the passage. This thin source of documentation doesn't tell us a whole lot about how the average Briton talked. It's safe to assume that there was local variation in vocabulary and accent. Because the sources of the oldest forms of English are so sparse, it's worth remembering that old saw. History is written by the victors. But in this case we might say instead, history was written by the literate. English isn't spoken identically everywhere today, and we should think of English as a language that never has been uniform. But we'll never know what variations there were back at the beginning. 3. Old English. If you've heard of any Old English sources, you've heard of Beowulf. One of the reasons for that might be J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. Tolkien was really into the dark, mysterious moods of the Old English past, and though he's very famous among fantasy readers and moviegoers for his several books on the adventures of hobbits, he's equally famous among academics of Old English for being the guy who did one of the definitive analyses of Beowulf. Beowulf is a weird poem in many ways, but it has a lot to tell us about Old English. First of all, Beowulf represents pre-literate English. This is a poem that is more than 3,000 lines long. In the days before writing, people in lots of places besides Britain used long poems as a way of telling tales. Having a tale in poetic format meant that it was easier to remember, so that it changed less from telling to telling. Think of the songs you remember the lyrics to. You don't remember word for word the lines you read in a newspaper or a book. Beowulf is a story about a kind of superhero in Denmark who fights monsters to save the kingdom, then later becomes king and finally dies defeating a dragon. One thing that is weird and interesting about this is that this is an English story about a Danish kingdom. And this underlines where the roots of Old English came from. Those Germanic peoples who eventually came and took over Britain as the Anglo-Saxons spoke a language which was also an Indo-European language. Another branch of that Germanic offshoot of Indo-European had taken root in Scandinavia, so there must have been a kind of cultural sympathy among the speakers of Old English for the Germanic tales of their ancestors and kinsmen. In the tradition of Pictionary, I'm going to dig into a little detail on an Old English word that first appeared in Beowulf, but that we still use today. The words that have survived the 1,000 years or more since Old English, or even several thousand since Indo-European, are by their very nature basic words. What I mean by that is words that describe some aspect of life that's unchanging over the ages. The technical terms we use for our lives today are sure to be forgotten by future generations, or to have completely changed their meaning. Just as we've forgotten many terms that related to the days when horses were the principal mode of travel. But the things that don't change have a better chance of surviving in the language. The word I've chosen to illustrate this for Old English and Beowulf is the word earth. These days we give quite a range of meanings to the word earth. For example, that ball hanging in the sky in one of the pictures from space, or the brown stuff we dig in our gardens. April 22nd has been declared Earth Day, and the meaning here is supposed to be one of the natural world. When the word earth was first written down in English, it had already been in use verbally for a long time, long enough that it had already acquired a range of meanings. When it appeared in Beowulf, it actually appeared with 3 different meanings. The first appearance was right near the beginning of the poem, before the monsters attacked, when the world was a lovely place to live in. Earth is one of the things described as what God made, along with the sun in the sky and the trees with their leaves, and it's described in Beowulf as being surrounded by water. So here, earth clearly means terra firma. So this first use of earth certainly is one we recognize, although it would have been pronounced differently back then. Probably something like Eorthan. The word earth reappears later in the tale when our hero Beowulf is in the heat of battle with the second of the three monsters of the story. With the full force of his superhuman arm, he brings down upon her head a fabled jewel-encrusted battle-sword, veteran of many storied clashes. But instead of splitting her skull, the sword bounces out of Beowulf's hand. He has no choice but to engage her in a good old-fashioned wrestling match, while the sword lies there on the earth. So here earth again is something we easily recognize. It's just the ground. The third sense of earth in Beowulf is as a qualifier. The final battle is the one that kills both Beowulf and the dragon. This is the classic dragon that flies and breathes fire. Yet the use of earth here is to call the dragon an earth dragon. The reason for this is that those old English speakers seem to have loved to weave deep meanings into the words. Beowulf scholars sometimes see the dragon that kills Beowulf as symbolic of death and the elemental power of death. The dragon lived underground, soared through the air, breathed fire, and finally died and was consumed by the waves. Earth, air, fire, and water, the elements as unstoppable as death. And, that old Beowulf dragon seems to have shared a suspicious number of earth, air, fire, and water traits with the dragon in J.R.R. Tolkien's The Hobbit. If you ever get a chance to read Beowulf in its original Old English, it's likely you won't understand a word of it. The reason is that Old English is just as much of a different language from English as is Latin, German, French, or Spanish. And the difference goes beyond just a different set of words, a different vocabulary. If you get a hold of an Old English document, not only will most of the words look nonsensical to you, the letters themselves won't all make sense. It may come as a surprise to you that as recently as 300 years ago, the letters J and V were not universally agreed to be part of the English alphabet. Since the alphabet is a reflection of the language we speak, it makes sense that as the language changes, so does the alphabet. Those monks and scholars trying to express a spoken language in writing turned, of course, to the written language that they knew, Latin, and used its letters. But since Old English also included some sounds that weren't used in Latin, those early English writers had to be a little creative. The th sound in the word earth from Beowulf is an example. Th sounds were so important to Old English speakers that they didn't add just one new character to deal with it, they added two, F and Thorn. One of these they borrowed from the runic alphabet. Now, here I'm going to contradict myself. I said that the Anglo-Saxons were illiterate, but in fact they brought with them a system of writing called runes. J.R.R. Tolkien makes use of runes in his Hobbit stories, but their use in Britain is even more scant than the evidence for Old English, so they aren't much help in figuring out how those first Anglo-Saxons actually sounded. The evidence of Old English really starts to accumulate in the 10th century, but we do know something of what went on before that. When you hear a word that goes back to Latin and sometimes to Greek, most of the connections arrived with Middle English, but not all. Looking back at the beginnings of Latin, we find that those Romans built their empire in the aftermath of an earlier Greek domination of the Mediterranean world. Since Greek is also an Indo-European language, and since the foundations laid by the Greeks influenced a large number of Latin words, wherever Latin finds its way into English, there are often Greek historical connections as well. As far as the Anglo-Saxons were concerned, even though Roman influence didn't extend to Britain until about 2,000 years ago, the Germanic tribes, being on the same continent as the Romans, had been trading and fighting with the Romans for as much as 500 years before that. During that time, a number of Latin words had made their way into the vocabulary of the Anglo-Saxons, who then brought them to Britain. It took some time, perhaps as much as a few centuries after their first arrival, before the Anglo-Saxons can be said to have become speakers of Old English, or English people. But the reason we call England, England, and English, English, is because of the Anglo part of Anglo-Saxon. The Angles were one of the Germanic tribes, and it's their tribal name that evolved into the name for the place, the language, and the people. Anglo-land became England, and Anglish became English. Between the establishment of the Anglo-Saxons in Britain and the time they really began to record their language and history, they were rudely interrupted. Just as Christianity was beginning to take hold and Latin literacy was again establishing itself in the religious and intellectual centers, who should arrive but those pesky Vikings? All that sacking and looting tended to have a bad effect on literacy. The places where literacy was most likely to be taking hold were the same places where money and riches were available for the taking. Needless to say, arriving at a monastery and killing everyone there would tend to reduce the output of writings. Perhaps the most famous example of this was at Lindisfarne. At this monastery, sometime around the year 700, was produced one of the most prized possessions now in the hands of the British Museum. It's one of the most richly illuminated manuscripts in existence. Obviously, Lindisfarne was one of the centers of brains and bucks in its day. Within 100 years, though, the Vikings arrived here for one of their first big attacks, slaughtering man and beast alike. Over the next 100 years, the Vikings showed more and more chutzpah, and instead of just raiding, began spending the winter, and eventually started to move in and take over. These Vikings were from present-day Denmark and Norway, and the territory they staked out, which amounted to practically the entire northern half of Britain, became known as the Danelaw. Because they came from the north, they were known as Northmen or Norsemen by the Anglo-Saxons. It appears that the only thing that prevented the Vikings from taking over the entire English island was a guy whose name I think you'll recognize, King Alfred the Great. It's been pointed out to me more than once that Alfred is the only English king to carry the title the Great. Here was one wise man. He spent decades fighting the Vikings, but dominated them not simply by beating them on the battlefield. He beat them too in diplomacy and in preparation for the battles he knew were to come. Not only do you recognize the name Alfred the Great, you're comfortable with the name Alfred, and you wouldn't find it hard to remember the name of someone named Alfred that you met at a party. Compare this to the names of Alfred's parents. His father was King Ethelwulf, and his mother Osberga. Those sound so Old English. It's a mark of Alfred's greatness that his name still sounds so modern. The reason he was great was that he was different from his contemporaries. Alfred was the fifth of 5 boys, and had never expected to become king. As a kid, one day his mother was reading some poetry to her children from one of the rare books that only people like a king's family would have had in those days. She offered the book to whichever of her boys was the first to learn to read it. Even though he was the youngest, Alfred was the keenest to learn to read, and so won the book. Later, as king, after years of battling the Vikings, he did something unheard of. He fought them into submission and then made them sign a treaty. Sign a treaty. That's what was unheard of. The Vikings didn't hold with book learning any more than the Anglo-Saxons had earlier, but it worked. Between Alfred's alliances, his planned defenses, and his written record of what belonged to who, the Vikings stuck to their Danelaw and let him rule Wessex, if not all England. Alfred complained that he and his people couldn't learn as much as could be learned in continental Europe, simply because there were so few teachers around even to teach reading and writing. So Alfred set about building almost from scratch a literate society. He brought scholars from as many places in England as he could find, and when that wasn't enough, he imported them from the continent. In the century that followed, there was a seeming explosion of written English. To modern scholars, it represents the first big pulse of material representing Old English. And in kick-starting literacy, he made another innovation. Up until that point in England, and also in other parts of Europe, where literacy had been valued, it had been Latin literacy. Alfred also wanted English literacy. He was one of the first to imagine that it might be a good idea not only to teach people to read and write, but to teach them in a language that they actually spoke. So, this seems an appropriate place to dip again into the dictionary and pull up a word that King Alfred was the first to establish in written English. And among modern scholars there's still debate as to whether it was Alfred himself who did the translations of important Latin works into English, or if it was done under his command. On the one hand, it's reasonable to believe that having assembled learned men from far and wide, Alfred would certainly use them instead of doing all the work himself. But on the other hand, we have to remember that those were slower times, much slower. Then, as now, a king has more choice in how to spend his day than most folks. And it's pretty clear that for Alfred, this writing stuff really turned his crank. And besides that, the documents he chose to translate were likely ones already well known to him. There were less to choose from, for one thing, so he wouldn't have had to gone and studied. These were works he'd been studying all his life. He just had to write them down in the common language. In a time when government was far, far less complicated, it's quite conceivable that King Alfred did in fact do the translations himself. The word I've chosen to represent Alfred is island. A good word for an emerging England, and another word that reflects something unchanging. In English, island hasn't changed its basic meaning much since it first appeared. But like Earth, island also has a history back into Indo-European. It's actually related to the word aqua, a word from Latin meaning water. A similar word from Indo-European worked its way up into the Germanic parent languages of Old English and emerged in a few related words, including aig. This meant something on the water or something watery, and maybe even island itself. By the time it got into Old English, people had clearly designated it as dry land by glomming the word land on the end of it, building a new word out of components, as was their habit. Neither of the two spellings of island that occur in Alfred or contemporary work actually have an S in them. Some are just I-land, others Igland with a G. That G makes its historical connection with aqua a little easier to hear in the word. Aqua, agua, aig. The G sound is particularly northern, and here again we cross paths with the idea of dialects. While Alfred was instrumental in establishing the beginnings of urban centres in southern England, most people, the vast majority, still lived rurally. While Alfred gathered his scholars and began a written tradition, that writing was at first done in the dialect of Alfred's West Saxon. We have no way of knowing how similarly or differently English was being spoken in other parts of England until scholars from other regions start getting into the act. The nation-building that Alfred began endured. His son united all the kingdoms that were not in the Danelaw, and then his grandson managed to include the Danelaw. The grandson, named Athelstan, was the first to call himself King of the English. Meanwhile, outside the centres of literacy, people were still talking to each other, in forms of English that weren't being captured. Over the following centuries, we see trickling into the written record words from other dialects of Old English, as well as from Old Norse of the now settled Vikings. 4. Middle English. I want to be clear that there is no specific date or time marking the end of Old English and the beginning of Middle English. As I've said, not everyone in England spoke quite the same version of English. So, if you could pin down a speaker or writer of Middle English at some point after Middle English began, there's sure to have been someone else, living somewhere else in England, who was still speaking solid Old English. Although changes in language can happen slowly or more rapidly, language change involves thousands of factors. Individual words morph in pronunciation and meaning. Emphasis is added. Endings drop off. The importance of word order changes. And all these changes happen one by one. So instead of going to bed on a Wednesday speaking Old English and waking up on Thursday speaking Middle English, the transition is smeared across decades, and perhaps even centuries. That said, Middle English did begin around midday on Thursday, September 28th, 1066. This is when French arrived in England, with the majority of the Latin word roots you hear about. It arrived on a ship called the Mora that had to make shore before the tide went out at noon, and it arrived under the command of William the Bastard, later known, once he'd taken over England, as William the Conqueror. William was called the Conqueror because he led his Norman army to victory in the Norman conquest of England. He was called William the Bastard not because he treated the English people badly, although he did, but because his parents hadn't been married. William's conquest was called the Norman Conquest because William and his army were based in Normandy, on the north coast of France. The funny thing is that the reason the place was called Normandy was that those pesky Norsemen, the Vikings, had also taken over there in the previous 3 centuries. Although in England the Germanic language of the Anglo-Saxons had resisted changes from the indigenous Celtic language, the old Norse-speaking ancestors of William and his gang had almost completely gone native, and were all speaking French. The reasons that William was able to land in England and beat the reigning King Harold are complex. But one was certainly that those annoying Vikings were at it again. On September 20th, King Harold had been sitting in London when he got news of a Viking attack. By September 24th, he'd marched his troops 190 miles to the scene of the carnage, and the next day beat the tar out of the Viking horde and sent them packing. He'd hardly caught his breath when news arrived of William's landing on the 28th, another 250 miles away. So in barely 2 weeks, Harold went from sitting at home to beating back the Vikings to taking on William the Bastard, in the process leading his army almost 450 miles. It probably didn't help that Harold had just learned that the Pope had said that God was on William's side. In any case, Harold got shot in the eye with an arrow and died. When William took over, things changed in England. Not only did Harold get killed, but all of what we might call the management were deposed and replaced with French noblemen and administrators. The language of the governing classes was suddenly French. A detailed accounting of all the wealth in the entire country was made. No kidding. They tried at least to count people's wealth right down to the last farm animal, so they'd know how to divvy up the spoils and charge taxes. That's what that thing called the Doomsday Book was about. The Doomsday Book was literally a goose-by-goose accounting of every person in England and all of their possessions so that the French could tax them. William did not rule benevolently. This was when all those castles in England started to be built. It was under William that the Tower of London was built. Just as under Alfred the Great, where there is money and power, that's where you'll find most people who can read and write. Of course, with French ruling classes, the writing was in French. As the years went by, English people looking to make a better life for themselves under a French regime made an effort to learn French. By this time, there was an established body of English readers and writers as well. Although the royal court had gone French, and this meant that there was no longer a prestige center of English literacy, English people knew how to write, and so kept doing it. But without a central example to set some kind of standard, they did so with the peculiarities of their own regions. There are those dialects again. Through the period after the Norman Conquest, modern scholars can see more clearly how English varied from place to place. Because no one had even thought of inventing a dictionary yet, people simply jotted down whatever combination of letters seemed to them to form the same sound as how they pronounced the word. To us, they look like spelling mistakes, but there is a degree of consistency to them that gives scholars clues as to how pronunciations and vocabularies varied from region to region. English writers began dropping French words into their work, and with time, these words became regarded as English words. One of the reasons that we recognize so many English words as having Latin roots is that French used to be Latin. It was those Romans tromping all over Europe and setting up Latin-speaking regimes that caused places like France and Spain to pick up the language too. After the fall of the Roman Empire, the Latin in these places continued to morph. The reason these languages are called Romance languages is because they evolved from the language of Rome. You've heard of Geoffrey Chaucer. The most famous thing he wrote is the Canterbury Tales, and it's an example of Middle English that everyone's heard of. And so it's the one I'll use for a dictionary-like exploration of a Middle English word. And the one I've come up with is magic. Chaucer was the first to write this French word magic in English, but it had a different meaning then than now. Before French, it had a long history, stretching back through Latin and Greek to Persian and possibly to Indo-European. The old Persian word, mage, may be from an Indo-European root, mar, that held a meaning of to be able or to have power. And this is the parent not only of our word magic, but also of the word machine. Although you probably haven't read them, J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter books have also been translated entirely into Latin. In the sales description for these books, you can see that Harrius Potter est magus, which is to say that Harry Potter is a wizard. The wise men who attended the baby Jesus, the We Three Kings, were also called magi, which is plural for magus. Today, we probe for answers using the scientific method. Back in Chaucer's time, not only did the thinkers of the day not have the benefit of electron microscopes, particle accelerators, and gene splicing, they didn't even have the benefit of the scientific method. So it's not too surprising that when Chaucer first used the word magic for the first time, there wasn't a huge difference in meaning from what we would now call science. By the time of Shakespeare, the word magic had begun to take on a sense of mystery more than science, although still highly respected mystery. Only in 1831 do we have the first citation of magic, meaning conjuring and sleight of hand. The French aristocracy in England never went away. But as we all know, the national language of England isn't French. How come? Those French kings and knights held on to their French, but as time went on, they had a harder and harder time governing the lands they still owned back over in Normandy. The uppity French nobility started to move in on the English French nobility's French holdings. So, even though the government in England was in fact French, France became some kind of enemy. Eventually the English French decided maybe English was important after all, so let's downplay this French thing. In the latter part of the 1300s, when Chaucer was a young man, King Edward III opened Parliament with an English speech for the first time, and presided over a new law that mandated court proceedings take place in English. 40 years later, Henry V went even further, being the first king since the Normans to be able to actually write in English. And still, Henry V spoke French, married the French king's daughter, and for a short time was even the King of France. This adoption of English as a national language was political. You need the people behind you if you're fighting a bunch of wars. English became the pride of the nation, and a myth began to grow up around the Englishness of English kings. In truth, there was more to the coming of Middle English than just the Normans and their French. But the French period is a convenient peg upon which to hang our historical understanding. What I said of the coming of Middle English, that it didn't happen all at once, is also true of its going. Chaucer is believed to have died around the year 1400, and although some say modern English doesn't really get going until 100 years later, I want you to peg that 1400, both because it's when Chaucer kicked the bucket, and because it's the same year someone else was born, who had a big influence on language and literacy generally. 5. The arrival of printing. Of course you've heard of Gutenberg. A copy of the Gutenberg Bible fetched $5.5 million at auction 20 years ago, and that was just the Old Testament part. What makes you remember the name Gutenberg? And what makes his Bible so expensive? Johannes Gutenberg was born the same year that Chaucer died. Gutenberg is the inventor of the movable type printing press. Before Gutenberg there had been printing, but it was a pretty cumbersome process, and just writing something out by hand had been much easier. Even putting together a whole monastery full of monks to write out a bunch of copies had been easier. But the technology that Gutenberg dreamed up was such a huge advance that it's not a stretch to say that printing technology didn't substantially improve again for another 500 years. But Gutenberg only has a peripheral role to play in this story. He invented the thing, but it was another guy who brought the printing press to England, and his name was William Caxton. William Caxton was a businessman. He was a few years younger than Gutenberg, and for the first half of his life he was too busy making a fortune trading between England and Europe to worry about books and literature. And of course, printing hadn't yet been invented. But then, once he was fat and happy, he got philosophical and sat back to enjoy the finer things of life, including such intellectual pursuits as translating the history of the Trojan War into English. All that writing is hard work, and he got fed up with it. Fortunately, he just happened to be living in Germany and heard about this cool new invention. This was within 6 years of Gutenberg running off his first proof. Caxton was nothing if not practical, and so set up his own printing press, first in Belgium and then in England. This guy was a businessman's businessman. Knowing a good thing when he saw it, he threw all his energies into making it a profitable venture. Oh, that Chaucer guy, people like him. I bet Canterbury Tales will sell well. A few years later, a second printing, with bonus material not found in the original, just like DVDs today. New, improved, now with woodcuts. That means pictures. We also know that Caxton didn't mind rewriting an author's work when he thought that approach would be more profitable. Remember now, printing had only just been invented. Who needed copyright laws? There's a great story about another of Caxton's books, where an older manuscript has been found. And not only an older manuscript, but the very manuscript that Caxton used in preparing his print proofs. There are considerable differences between some of the text in the original manuscript and that which Caxton actually printed. Yet there, on each and every page of the manuscript, are little ink marks that show that Caxton was comparing the text of the manuscript to that of the printed pages as they came off the press, setting them aside, interleaved, as he looked at the next page. So there's no question that he knew what he was doing when he, quote, improved the text. Now, we shouldn't assume that as soon as Caxton set up shop, the population immediately started reading more. In fact, for a long time, it continued to be economical to churn out manuscripts by hand instead of having them printed. Even printed books were a pricey proposition. They were still using vellum and parchment made out of sheepskins instead of paper. But Caxton was the start of something big. Caxton himself writes about the diversity of dialects in England, but already, when he set up his presses in England, there existed a nucleus of English language standardization that would begin to creep out and convert the greater part of the country to a much more homogeneous form of English. Back when Edward III pushed for English legal proceedings, the group of government document clerks at a place called the Chancery began among themselves to establish spelling and grammar conventions that, with the addition of printing to the mix, would form perhaps the first standard version of English. So before we let go of old William Caxton, I thought I'd indulge in another Predictionary moment. This time with a twist. 2 twists, actually. Normally I choose words that are in common use so that I can dig out some uncommon information about them. This word is definitely not in common use, and that's actually the reason I chose it. In every case so far, I have examined how words come into the language. Here is a word, flitch, that has instead gone out of the language. Caxton used it, and it had been around since the earliest Old English, but we don't use it anymore. It originally meant a side of meat butchered from an animal. Because there is some fashion and utility to words, if they don't serve a purpose, people stop using them. The purpose might disappear if technology changes, or maybe it's just that a better word comes up. For reasons unknown, flitch dropped out of sight. Well, almost out of sight. There is a little town in England called Dunmow, and the story goes that 900 years ago, a local nobleman and his bride of 1 year and a day, disguised as paupers, asked the local clergyman to bless their union. The generous vicar not only blessed them, but congratulated them on their continued devotion to one another, and gave them a side of bacon. Throwing off his disguise, the nobleman returned the generosity by donating a big tract of land to the church, and saying that some loving couple should be awarded a flitch of bacon every year. However quaint this might sound, the contest is mentioned in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, as well as other earlier documents, so there must be some truth to it. And what's more, the tradition lives on, called the Dunmow Flitch Trials. If you are a loving couple married a year and a day, you too can travel to Dunmow and try to convince the jury that you're still happy to be married. Somebody has to win that side of bacon. That flitch might as well be you. 6. Shakespeare. William Shakespeare is such a famous contributor to the English language that there's even a word, bardolatry, to describe the extremes of praise heaped on Shakespeare that approach worship of the bard. He lived in a period when more new words were flowing into English than ever before, and he is credited with personally adding not only more words than any other individual, but some say that he introduced more words than all of his contemporaries put together. The number of words he contributed has been estimated to be as high as 10,000. I think these kind of claims are bordering on bardolatry. The reason I chose to have a section on Shakespeare is that, first of all, he's the single most recognized English writer of all time, so I expect to remember his name, and you'll have an easier time placing the events that surround him in some kind of context. Secondly, the events that surround him are quite important in the development of English. William Shakespeare gave us a lot of new words, and he gave us some very enduring works of literature and an astounding number of quotable quotes. I love Shakespeare, and I quote and reference him all the time, but he himself didn't much steer the direction of the English language. Let's look a little more closely at what he did and didn't do before we look at what else was happening in the English language around his lifetime. To begin with, I'll peg his lifetime about 400 years ago. He died in 1616, so 1600 is a nice round number to keep in mind. Although, as I said, someone's supposed to have claimed that Shakespeare introduced as many as 10,000 words, more believable estimates are closer to 1,500. The Oxford English Dictionary contains something like 30,000 Shakespeare citations, and that's more than anyone else. But that doesn't mean he invented all those words. First of all, quite a lot of them are actually the same word. North, meaning a direction, the northern part of England, or an abbreviation for the north wind, shouldn't really count as 3 different words. But they are, in fact, 3 Shakespeare citations. For many of those 30,000, there'll be an earlier citation. For many of them, even if William Shakespeare is the first citation, that doesn't necessarily mean that he himself dreamed up the word. It may have been in verbal circulation for years, and it's just that he was the first to write it down. More likely than that, even, is that it was actually written down by someone else, but dictionary makers haven't stumbled across it yet. This might be because Shakespeare was more famous, and so more of his work survived. Or it might be that Shakespeare was seen by the dictionary makers as exemplary of how a word can be nicely expressed, and so they never even looked in books by writers who might have used the same word, but who might be considered hack writers. Some of the words being counted are also simply minor alterations to existing words. Can we really count a word like blood-sucking when we have citations for blood-sucker 200 years earlier? I'm a big Shakespeare fan, and I love the fact that people are quoting him all the time without even knowing it. For example, neither a borrower nor a lender be. To thine own self be true. Something is rotten in the state of Denmark. And, since brevity is the soul of wit. I'll stop with the quotations now. So Shakespeare is masterful in how he uses an existing and developing English language more than how he himself influenced it. So let me turn to the world in which Old Will lived. During his life, and for a century or so either side of it, things were happening with the English language, and happening fast. Words were flowing into the language at record rates. The numbers of people who could read was growing, and the number of things available to read was growing. Earlier, there were no books around, so there was little point in being able to read. And since no one could read, it wasn't worth producing books. But by 100 years or so after Caxton, the the presses were well oiled enough that most books were no longer handwritten. More and more people could read, and the circle really began to feed on itself. How to meet the growing demand? One of the earliest ways was to take stories that already had a proven track record in other languages, and that usually meant Latin, and translate them into English. Many of these new readers were not part of the upper classes, and although they may have had an education in English, by the standards of the universities they, as was said of Shakespeare himself by his contemporary Ben Jonson, had small Latin and less Greek, which meant that they couldn't read all those classic works in the original. The result was that a new pile of Latin and some Greek words began to find their way into English as untranslatables in the translated books. These English words with Latin roots were different from the ones that arrived with French. In many cases, they'd never been French words. This was also the time when the more severe differences in dialect from one area of England to another began to be ironed out. Earlier, one of Caxton's London merchant buddies had found himself stranded and hungry in another part of England, and when he asked a farm wife if he could buy some eggs, her dialect was different enough that she replied that she couldn't speak French. But now, with spreading literacy and commonality of reading material, some of this was changing. Another source of new words with Latin roots was the fact that Latin still held lots of prestige, but that prestige was bending under the weight of new literacy. Both the church and the universities still saw Latin as the secret sauce, and as a consequence, when a high-level, influential book was published, it was usually in Latin. But change extended to the church, and certainly into the universities. These were the decades and centuries of religious strife, when people were being burned at the stake for being Protestant, or a few short years later, for being Catholic instead. Just like the royals when needing to fight the French, a battle is easier to win when you have public opinion behind you. So wouldn't it make sense to communicate with your potential supporters in a language that they could speak? Hence, English Bibles appeared, were burned, appeared again, and slowly began to erode the strength of religious Latin. One of the most famous Bibles of the English language, the King James Bible, was produced just 5 years before Shakespeare's death. These were also the decades and centuries of scientific discovery. The creativity of Leonardo da Vinci was 100 years before Shakespeare. A short generation later, Nicholas Copernicus figured out that the Earth rotated around the Sun, not the other way around, as we self-centered humans had previously thought. Galileo was just a little younger than Shakespeare and shared years on this earth with him, almost being put to torture by the church because he believed the math of Copernicus. Most of these guys weren't English, but they'd have been writing in Latin. There were English scientists too, such as William Harvey, who, about the time of Shakespeare's death, discovered that blood actually circulates within the body. There was William Gilbert, a Shakespearean contemporary, who is a great example, because he's supposed to have been the first Englishman to use the word electric, but not in English, in Latin. Sir Isaac Newton was born 27 years after Shakespeare, and in the year that Newton turned 17, the Royal Society of London for Improving Natural Knowledge was established. People wanted to know what great thoughts were going on behind that scholarly veil of Latin. It's been estimated that by about 1600, approximately half the population of England had some level of English literacy. So just as the words from the classics had dribbled into English, so too did the Latin and Greek of science. And that's not all. Oh no, that is not all, to quote the Cat in the Hat. It was during Shakespeare's lifetime that England began to colonize the east coast of North America. This sowed the seeds that eventually would have a profound impact on the English language. But at the time, other European powers had already been exploring and colonizing. In so doing, France and Spain and others were discovering new things in the New World. These new things had new names, and English often got words for these new things through other European languages, picked up originally from Native American languages. Potato and tomato come to mind. So that was the world in the centuries around Shakespeare. The loosely defined beginning of what we call modern English is supposed to have seen the word stock increase from about 100,000 to 200,000 words. Modern dictionary-making methods include computers and databases of words, and it's certainly easier for a computer to comb through a pile of electronic books and turn up the first citations of a word than it is for a person or a team of people. So, to underline the bardolatry point, I'll tell you that Oxford dictionaries themselves reported in 2002 that by using these techniques in developing the third edition of the Oxford English Dictionary, they had found numerous cases where Shakespeare had before been listed as the first cited author, but now was discovered to really be a reuser of the word. The examples they mentioned were the words majestically and neglected. Fitting words for mistakes you've made about Shakespeare, I guess. So now that I've put Shakespeare in his place, I'll dip into the Pictionary reservoir to find an appropriate Shakespearean word. If you're a worshipper of the bard, all this disrespectful talk I'm spewing may make you feel sick to your stomach. Conversely, if you think too much is being made of Shakespeare 400 years after his glory days, you might be sick of hearing about him. In either case, it's appropriate that I'm choosing as the word to represent Shakespeare the word puke. William Shakespeare is cited in the Oxford English Dictionary 2nd edition to be the first of any man or woman to have set the word puke to paper. Puke meaning vomit, throw up, regurgitate, barf. That first citation is from 1600. Another reason to choose the word, that nice round number I asked you to remember. And it's from his play, As You Like It. And I think you'll like the passage it comes from as well. You've heard it before. All the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players. They have their exits and their entrances, and one man in his time plays many parts, his acts being 7 ages. At first the infant, mewling and puking in the nurse's arms. So how could William have expected anyone in his audience to understand the word puke if it hadn't existed before? There had to be some context for people to understand that the infant wasn't smiling or feeding in his nurse's arms. Looking at the etymology sources, it appears that although the word itself may never have been written down, another word, pukishness, had appeared about 20 years before. And that word appeared in a book about the value of an education. For boys only, mind you. The specific passage advocates how healthy it is for students to speak loudly, because the author says it's a form of exercise. He goes on at length on the benefits of talking with a loud voice, and I guess Shakespeare would agree, since stage actors must bellow their lines. This earlier author believes that communicating at the top of your lungs is a cure for everything from bad circulation and elephantitis to diarrhea and leprosy. I'm not kidding, he says that. Could this be evidence of a hack writer of the type that dictionary makers wish not to quote? Anyway, evidently talking loudly cures pukishness as well. The implication for us here isn't that we should all take up public speaking, but that there was a word in circulation that William Shakespeare made use of here. Looking again at the etymological sources, I see that the word puke is possibly related to another word you'll recognize, spew, which did appear as far back as King Alfred's time. Wonder of wonders, it also first meant barf. And I see something else here too. All those computers and databases are being deployed against William Shakespeare and his claim to the word puke. The 3rd edition of the Oxford English Dictionary hasn't even been printed yet, but its draft entry for puke ousts Shakespeare as the first coiner, and in his place names Philemon Holland. I've never heard of Philemon Holland either. 7. American English. When English first arrived in America, sort of like when those Anglo-Saxons first arrived in Britain, people were already here talking to each other. Of course, there were the many and varied languages of the North American Indians, but there were also European languages, French to the north, Spanish to the south. The implications of these other languages for American English was pretty minimal, just like the Celtic influence on Old English. There were new words for new things in a new world, certainly, and many of those came from the North American Indian languages, and some of these even filtered through Spanish before making it into English. But for the most part, the English speakers who arrived in North America looked upon the Spanish and French and other Europeans as enemies, so weren't picking up their lingo all that readily. The Native Americans represented a shifting ground of ally and enemy, and recent studies seem to indicate that over a few centuries immediately preceding the arrival of English settlers, the Indians had suffered a dramatic societal collapse based on the arrival of European disease. The very first European encounters describe vastly more people inhabiting the Americas than seems to have been the case when the first Englishmen came and started camping out in the seeming wilderness. So North American natives were not in a position of strength, either to push the settlers off their campsites, nor to heavily influence their language. So at the very time when English settlers began to make a mark on America, English was just settling down into early modern English. Although many of the dialects of England had been ironed out by that time, by no means all of them had, and haven't yet to this day. So the people who walked onto those ships in England 400 years ago, and off those ships in the New World, brought with them the dialects of their particular English backgrounds. Once they got here, the major barrier of the Atlantic Ocean began to do for modern English what the English Channel had done for the Germanic language 1500 years before. English continued to evolve, and English visitors to America 200 and 300 years ago noticed the differences, but said they heard almost no dialect variations as they traveled around America. Back home in England, they heard Scottish dialect, Irish accents, as well as the dialects within London itself. The American lack of dialects appeared remarkable to them. In part, their perception was true. The nation was still young, and dialects take time to develop. What's more, the relative uniformity of social class of the people settling in America influenced the uniformity of their use of English. Perhaps also, though, these British visitors were not actually hearing the degree of variation. Just as an American today might have trouble placing an Englishman geographically by his accent, maybe the British visitors found the American variations too subtle to recognize. In America today, there is certainly dialect variation, but the patterns you see on a map look quite different from those that developed in England over the centuries. In America, specific dialects filled spaces on maps as settlers moved up rivers and west into newly settled territories. Perhaps some of those British observers were following the trails of the dialects themselves, since the transportation and communications routes were still developing. American dialects radiated out from major centers and mixed with the influences of populations of other ethnic speakers, like Dutch, German, and Swedish. Physical barriers like the Mississippi River and the Appalachian Mountains tended to divide American English speakers to a lesser extent than the Atlantic did from England, but still allowed distinctive ways of speaking to develop. When the California gold rush came along, all those prospectors had to come from somewhere, and many of them came from the eastern seaboard, thus explaining why there's more variation of pronunciation between north and south than between east and west. Even if the variations in dialect weren't apparent to all British visitors, Thomas Jefferson certainly recognized them and said a person could judge their latitude based on the way people around them were speaking. A good example of American dialect is Mark Twain's Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Today, Huckleberry Finn is seen as something of a landmark in American literature, but when it first came out, some saw it as the lowest kind of writing, because of the dialect it was written in. Supposedly, the library in Concord, Massachusetts, wouldn't even stock the book because of, quote, the coarse, ignorant language in which it was narrated. But you and I know that people really did talk like that, do talk much like that still. Mark Twain's genius was in capturing it on the page, where Noah Webster might have turned up his nose. And now, since the time of Mark Twain, American English has come to be the more influential branch of English. The population of the United States is 5 times that of Britain, and because of this larger number, as the English language naturally evolves, more of that evolution now happens in North America than in England. 8. World English. I'm Canadian, and Canadian English retained elements of British English while being far more influenced by sharing a continent with the United States. One major influence on the similarity between Canadian and American English is due to the American-born English loyalists who fled to Canada after the American Revolution. Their accents and vocabulary shared the same roots as those that stayed behind and celebrated independence. Of course, English took root in many other places besides North America. The usual suspects in a list like this would include Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa. But in fact, the English language has established itself so deeply in so many places that it appears to be the new global language. There are more native speakers of Mandarin, but the influence of English is unparalleled. The European Union, is a political organization that operates in 23 different languages and represents speakers of even more. The highest number of any single language group is German. But when two Europeans of different background are talking, it's English that's most likely to be the language used. The European Union is governed by the European Commission, and although it's headquartered in Brussels, Belgium, English is one of the 3 official languages for its operation. 4 out of 5 students in non-English Europe take English courses. It's because Britain so enthusiastically claimed colonies for its empire that there are well over a dozen countries in Africa whose populations speak English. There are more than 100 million English speakers in Africa. As we've seen, language change is unstoppable, so it's wrong to think that the changes we see in our lifetime mean that English is going to hell in a handbasket. Similarly, it's wrong to think that the dominance of English as a world language is due to some innate superiority of English. The reason that Latin spread across Europe 2,000 years ago was that it was politically and economically expedient for non-Latin speakers to pick it up. English took on board so many French words for the same reason. With the former strength of the British Empire and the current combined strength of America plus all other English-speaking nations' economies, it's only natural that people in other countries jump on the bandwagon. Although military might has something to do with it, it's economic and cultural might that have more influence. People often object to foreign armies in their countries, but they're much more welcoming of opportunities to make money or to be cool like those guys in the movies. So, when we think of where English is going in the future, we need to include in our calculations the economic and cultural strength of the various English-speaking nations. There's little question that the United States is top of the heap these days, and has been the leading force in change in English for several decades. But as globalization continues, there is another bigger nation where English has deep roots. Bollywood is the name given to the film industry in India, obviously after Hollywood in California. Bollywood produces more films per year than Hollywood, and sells more tickets, although Bollywood revenues remain considerably lower. But there is serious exportable cultural strength there, and increasing use of English. The 2 biggest countries where manufacturing and technology offshoring are going are China and India, each with well over 1 billion people. In India, there are dozens of languages, many of which are recognized as national official languages. When India gained its independence from Britain, a phase-out of English was planned that has been impossible to achieve. Instead, English has grown to be both a more powerful tool to hang the various language groups together into a nation and a valuable asset in international trade. English is only gaining prestige in India and likely to deepen its strength. India is probably the leading example of a new force that will change how English is spoken. Some words of Indian origin are already familiar, like pajamas, kebabs, the things you put on the barbecue, or shawl, the article of clothing. But as India's economic strength grows, will more of their words be heard more frequently in Australia, England, and North America? How about upgradation? That's what you might do to your software. Or go down, an Indian English word for warehouse. All these words are already in the Oxford English Dictionary. As well as manufactured goods, will China begin to export boatloads of words that we adopt into English? We've already adopted words from Japan, for example, tsunami and Sudoku. As the economic and cultural world continues to flatten, English and its speakers will benefit from words from all over. Conclusion. Looking forward. It's almost certain that English will continue to grow in its role as the world's language, but whether that means that everyone speaks the same type of English or not is still up in the air. Some experts predict a kind of world standard spoken English. This may mean that more and more people can speak internationally and understand each other, but it's unlikely to mean that local vocabularies, expressions, and pronunciations will disappear. For many thousands of years, people have been talking to each other, and for that whole time, the words they used and the way they used them has been shifting. Sometimes creeping change, sometimes galloping. Each one of us can remember new words or phrases that came into being or took on new meanings during our lives. Internet and blog are two examples of brand new words. text, and lame are old words with new meanings. We're living in a period of rapid change. There are so many users of English worldwide, and the language is being used in so many different creative ways that it's inevitable that this change is going to continue. But most of the change is going to be spread out, originating in a million little epicenters. The time when a single event or person could steer the whole course of the language is long gone. In the future, decisions on which way the language will go will be crowd-powered. There is no governing body. English is now more than ever a democratic process.
We hope you've enjoyed this Macmillan audio production of Global Wording. Text copyright 2008 by Charles Hodgson. Production copyright 2008 by Macmillan Audio. All rights reserved.